Color is hard, okay? I'm a professional graphic designer. I still think color is hard, but I also know that there are things that you can learn that make it a lot easier to work with and to figure out what you're actually gonna like. Hi, hello, my name is Allie. I'm a professional graphic designer and writer coming to you from just outside Toronto. This is my channel where I talk about what I'm knitting, how it's going, what it's costing me, and I get a lot of comments on the colors that I knit with, a lot of questions also, and I thought today maybe we could talk a little bit of just color theory 101. How do you pick colors to knit with that you're actually gonna love? Because I feel like, you know, there are many weaknesses in my knitting. I feel like one of my strengths is this. I don't tend to knit a lot of things that I end up not wearing because of something to do with the color. I tend to really love the colors of the things that I make. So I thought I'd see if I could share a little bit of that knowledge with you. In part, this comes from being a graphic designer. I went to school for design, so I have a little bit more formal training in the world of color theory than the average person. Also still not like an expert on it. I think that because it's not something that has really come super naturally to me, I think that I'm in a good position to teach it to somebody else because I very much had to learn these things and didn't really grasp it in like an intuitive way. As for my mug and tea of the day, I feel like this one was very on theme for the color videos. It's a very fun color combo. This is my mug from Base Ceramics, and out of it I'm drinking my usual Sloan Classic Earl Grey, and today I'm wearing my Lyon sweater by Petite Knit, which also I think is a kind of a fun color palette that's different from a lot of the other projects that I saw when I was looking at this pattern, and I think it's a fun case study in being able to produce something that's a very different vibe. The colors that you choose can really make a pattern feel like an entirely different pattern.
Editing Alley popping in with a little bit of housekeeping for the giveaway from the last video for the cat cowl pattern by Brianna Arlene. So the first winner of this giveaway, because there are actually two winners, because when I told Brianna about the giveaway I was planning to do, she also offered to provide a second pattern for giveaway. So our winner number one is Rebecca Lammert 8295, and you provided your Ravelry username, so this should already have been gifted to you on Ravelry by the time you see this video. And the second winner is Beth Knits, and same deal, this should already be in your Ravelry, so take a look out for that, and thanks so much to everybody for entering the giveaway.
Now, I think that the single most informative thing that you can do to help yourself understand what kind of colors you will like to wear is by researching your home. Look around your home. And I don't only mean your closet, okay? I want you to look at your whole home, and I also want you to look at your closet, and I want you to think about which colors are in both places. But starting with your closet, look in there and think about what pieces do you wear all the time, okay? Which ones do you just find yourself gravitating toward? But also, what pieces do you find that you get complimented on a lot, particularly if they're not things that seem super special? Like if there's just a t-shirt that you get a lot of compliments on and it's just a plain t-shirt, there's a really good chance that that specific color of that garment is what people are taking notice of. It's just a color that looks really good on you. I know I have observed this for myself anytime I wear royal blue, and I don't actually have a lot of royal blue things, so it really stands out to me when this happens. I get compliments all the time wearing that color. There are just certain colors that just pop on some people more than others based on the undertones of your skin. And this is the basis of the whole like color seasons thing. Like, are you a spring or a fall or a winter? Like that is what that's based on, is the idea of the undertones of your skin and how that interacts with all the different colors of the color wheel, which I have mixed feelings about as like an industry, but the basic premise of the color theory as it interacts with a particular person's personal coloring makes sense. Like the foundation is sound. But when I say we want to research your entire home and not just your wardrobe, I want you to think about what kinds of colors are everywhere in your house and not in your wardrobe, because I think that there's also often something interesting to be found there. If there's a particular color that you do gravitate toward, that you do enjoy, that you do decorate with, but that you never wear, there's a really good chance that you have sort of intuitively worked out that you don't like how that color looks on you, because if you love that color, why wouldn't you wear it? This is extremely the case for me. And this color, turquoise, seafoam green, anything in that like minty, turquoisey aqua realm, one of my absolute favorite colors. Like it is absolutely tied up there with a red orange. However, one of those you see on the channel all the time, and one of those you almost never do, because this color looks terrible on me. And not in any sort of like intellectual way where I sat down and looked at a color wheel and went, according to this, prescriptively, I'm not allowed to wear this color, but just that when I've bought things that color, I've just not felt compelled to wear them. I have found that they languish. I found that every time I put them on, I just kind of feel blah. And that just naturally results in you reaching for something less, right? So think about whether there are colors that occupy that realm for you, And that might be an opportunity where you can save yourself a little bit of heartache in knitting, where you might look at yarn in that color and get really excited about it as an object, the way you get excited about homewares in that color as an object. And then it's only kind of once you've put in all of the time and all of the effort to convert that into something that you wear that you might go, oh, wait a minute, I don't really like wearing this. So I think that if that's something that you can identify ahead of time by sort of comparing and contrasting what's in your wardrobe versus what's in your home, that can be really informative, and it shows what you've learned intuitively about color just in wearing it, in living around it, in existing with it. And I prefer this kind of strategy to color seasons tests because those can be helpful, but I think they can also be overly prescriptive and convoluted. I think above all, like if they're helpful to you, fantastic, but if doing any kind of research into that or having yourself tested for your colors, if that has made you no longer enjoy wearing something that you used to love, then something has gone wrong. Because the goal with thinking about the colors that we're wearing is not to strip things of our wardrobe that we used to like wearing. It's to enable us to love the things that we collect into our wardrobe even more. But to use this information that we gather by looking at our wardrobes, by looking at our homes, we need to fundamentally understand the basics of color. So this is where we're going to get into a little bit of actual color theory, but I promise you we're going to keep it super basic, quick. This is not complicated stuff. I promise you can handle it. I promise I'll do my best to make it not boring. I guess I can't promise you won't find it boring, but I will try my absolute hardest. So there are 3 sort of major attributes of color that we need to be able to label to describe. These are the 3 sort of main levers that you can pull to adjust a color in different ways. These are hue, saturation, and value. If you don't know what those mean, don't panic. Hue is like literally just what would we call it? Hues could be red, orange, yellow, blue, green, etc. Any color of the rainbow that you can name, that is a hue. Next, saturation is how pure or intense the color is. So really high saturation colors might be described as bright or rich, whereas low saturation colors might be described as dull or muddy or earthy. And then we have value, which is how light or dark a color is. So if you think about the primary colors like red, yellow, blue, as you would have them in elementary school, those are like the middle of the value range, right? We can go lighter or darker from there. So a color might be described as light or pastel on the upper end, or deep or dark on the lower end. So those are the 3 main qualities of a color that we need to be able to sort of look at and think about and identify. And it helps to have the vocabulary to describe them, to help you find what it is exactly that you're looking for. And the thing is that these levers can all be applied to any color. So we could start with, say, red orange, one of my favorite hues, as we know. Here it is in a sort of pure, like middle of the tonal range. It's not super light, it's not super dark. It's just middle of the road, red orange. And this is it in a pretty saturated version. But if I were looking at that thinking, you know, that's kind of too bright for me. It's not a thing I would think, but maybe it's a thing you would think. We could turn down the saturation on it a little bit. We could make it a little bit darker. We could make it a little bit lighter. We could bring the saturation back up, but bring it down again in value range. So now it's a richer, deeper red-orange, but that is still saturated. To compare, let's leave the value the same and decrease the saturation. And these are all still within the hue of red-orange. That hasn't changed. We could do the same thing with, let's take like a robin's egg blue, right? We can play with the saturation up or down on this one. We can play with the value up or down. So when I'm shopping for yarn, this often comes into play for me. I might pick up a skein of yarn and think, wow, I almost love this, but I really wish that it were more saturated. Or I really wish that it were just a little bit darker, right? It gives you the ability to sort of pull a color apart into these different lenses through which to look at it, to identify what exactly it is about it that's not working for you. And that might allow you to have an easier time finding the version of that color that does work for you. So returning to the idea of your closet and what you wear a lot, let's use these 3 lenses to think about what kind of colors you wear. So first of all, are there certain hues that you wear a lot? This is the easiest one to identify, right? If you look in your closet and you're like, the whole thing's blue. It's very easy to identify that your hue is blue. And let's make this a little bit easier. I'm gonna pop a color wheel up on screen. I know that for me in my knitting, something that comes up over and over again is the idea of my love for cuspy colors is what I tend to call them. The idea of the colors that people tend to fight about what to call them. Like, would you call it a red? Would you call it an orange? Or would you call it a yellow? Or would you call it a green? I really love seeing the range of comments about my Colette pullover. About half of them call it yellow, about half of them call it green. And I tend to really love colors that fall in that uncertain zone. And there is actually a name for that if we want to look at the color wheel. So these are the primary colors that you would have learned in elementary school, right? Red, yellow, blue. And then you probably also learned that if you mix those colors, you get the secondary colors of green, orange, and purple. But what I think a lot of people don't learn unless you study art a little bit further is the concept of tertiary colors, which is what you get. So primary, secondary, tertiary, okay? It's what you get when you mix each of the colors on the color wheel with the color next to it. So now that we have both primary and secondary on here, if we mix red and orange, we get red orange, okay? If we mix yellow and green, we get yellow green. So those red oranges and yellow greens, those are called tertiary colors. This is where I thrive. These are the colors that I love. They tend to be kinds of colors that people would describe as like unexpected. They're just very much not the basic colors that people think about when they think about colors, because we tend to think about the primary and secondary colors. So I just know that cuspy tertiary colors are the kinds of colors that I tend to lean toward. Your answer is probably going to be different. So looking at this wheel, which colors do you feel like you tend to gravitate toward? Which hues catch your attention? And thinking still about the clothes in your closet that you really get a lot of wear out of, where do they fall in terms of saturation level? Are you wearing a lot of highly saturated things? That might be things like jewel tones or like a really vibrant yellow. Things that are very pure and intense in their color, or do you really lean into things that are less saturated, like earth tones? And then of course, lastly, value. Do you tend to wear things that are really light or pastel in color? Do you wear things that are really dark, almost black? Do you wear things that are more in the middle? What do you find is your comfort zone in terms of the value of the colors that you like to wear? So these three basic ideas of hue, saturation, and value are three ways that you can analyze what you already love to wear and think about those elements when you're picking colors to move forward with in your knitting. And now circling back to the idea of, is there a color that you really love that you find that you just don't like wearing? Using these levers, we might be able to pull them a little bit to find a version of that color that does work better on you and that you do enjoy wearing more. I do think it's worth mentioning though that I think that there are limitations to this. You might find that you might love purple so much and just no version of purple really feels like it's thriving on you or you in it, because that's just how color theory goes. This is sort of part of the issue that I have my little bone to pick with color seasons theory. It just doesn't really track with color theory. The idea that any hue on the color wheel has a version that will look equally good on you as long as it's the exact right version of that hue. Just if this color is your absolute best color, it's very unlikely that any version of this color is going to be able to really compete with it. So I think that there's sort of a lack of prioritization in the color seasons, which is maybe intended to make it not too prescriptive, but I kind of feel like it goes the other way where it's like, you can wear yellow, you just have to wear this exact yellow, just hold this swatch up to everything. And it's like, I don't know, maybe it's just easier to know that we really thrive in vivid blues, you know? So that's where I think that color seasons are a very, like, if you were a person who can gather information and take what is valuable to you and leave the rest, I think you can learn a lot from it. But if you're someone who you know it's going to kind of get in your head and you're going to forever be worrying about like, well, it said I'm not allowed to wear a purple that's not this exact purple, and like, if that is you, if you know that you are going to be running everything through that framework forevermore, then I would skip it, because I think you can save yourself a lot of that anxiousness and learn a lot that is very useful just by, again, looking at what it is that you do wear and that you do gravitate toward. So like, are there versions of an aqua, turquoise, mint green, something in there that are gonna look better on me than others? Absolutely. But still none of them look good. Like, in order for them to work on me, they really need to get into a really deep, like, low value range, which, like, a dark teal is just so not the same color to me as this cup. It's not really serving the purpose. And so this is why I have sort of designed like a split custody between my two favorite colors, where in this arrangement, red gets to occupy my wardrobe because it looks good on me, and turquoise gets to occupy the rest of my house because it does not, but I still get to look at it all the time. So if we use red as an example, if you find that you love red and you just find it a bit hard to wear, you might find that by shifting the exact hue of that red a little bit, one side or the other on the color wheel, that might make it suit you better. This comes up a lot in the makeup world, the idea of, do you need a blue red lipstick or a yellow red lipstick? I think you and I both know that I very much prefer the yellow side of that color spectrum. There's all of these ways that you can manipulate a particular color and see if maybe one version of it works for you better than another. And I think in the world of knitting, this really comes into play the most when we're thinking about anything where we are combining colors. How do we pick the colors for this colorwork project or this stripey project or whatever it might be? And I think that this is where a lot of people get really stuck and kind of panic, because with single colored garments, you can just choose to knit those in neutrals, right? Like if you feel sort of overwhelmed and uncertain and you just don't know how to pick any other color, neutrals are very easy fallbacks that are gonna work pretty well for most people. And it's an easy sort of no-brainer way to start a project. And a lot of people shy away from multicolored projects just for lack of understanding of how they might want to combine colors, and having to make that decision of which colors to combine can stop you from casting on that project entirely, which I think that's really sad, because color work is so fun to do. And it's just an opportunity to have so much fun with color that when you understand it, when you start to have the tools to be able to play around with it, can be so much fun. I get it, right? Like in my work as a graphic designer, I have always felt like color palettes are not my strong suit. And I feel like I've actually learned a lot more about color and building color palettes over time, more through the process of interior design and decorating my home than I ever have within my work or my studies as a graphic designer. Because there's something about design where either you're designing a brand from the ground up and you're developing a color palette where it's sort of a complete blank slate, like it could be anything, or you're working with an established brand's color palette, it's all completely prescribed and you have no choices. And what's interesting to me about interior design is usually you're not designing an entire home in full, start to finish, at the exact same time, right? Like for most people, the home design process is a little bit more of a piecemeal process that happens over time as we save up and add pieces and decorate our homes as we go through our lives. And that means that it's sort of interesting in terms of color, where every time you're looking to add something into the space, you have these existing restrictions or parameters of what's already in there, and you get to think about, do I want to put in something that's going to match this particular thing exactly or that particular thing exactly? Or if I bring in something that's a new color, how does that interact with the other colors in the space? And so I feel like through doing that more over time, that has really helped me to gain a better understanding of just how to work with different color palettes and what kind of unexpected combinations I might end up with if I start with some parameters and then have the opportunity to think about introducing a new wildcard color into that scenario and what I might want it to be. So let's get into some tips for how to select colors to combine. So in choosing a color scheme for your color work, I think there are some sort of initial questions you can ask yourself to start helping you narrow things down. So first of all, do you like the idea of doing a color work project that is all neutrals, just different neutrals? Do you want to combine a neutral with a color? Like my serendipity sweater would be an example of this, right? Where I have the neutral brown, the neutral white, and then I also have as a pop of color, this color changing yarn. Or do you want to do something that is color on color, like this project, right? I have an orange and a pink here together. So just think about, out of those three pools, right? Neutral, neutral, neutral color, and color color, is there one of those that you feel most drawn toward in general, or even just in terms of what you're imagining for this project? And in color work, you also really want to think about contrast, which is basically the premise of how different these colors are. How much does one stand out against the other? And you might prefer a really high contrast look. Black and white is the absolute highest contrast you can go, but also just like a dark brown and a light beige is also a very high contrast. Or you can also get high contrast by using colors. It might be a dark blue and a light blue. But you might also find that you really like the look of a lower contrast look. Sometimes it can be deliberately really low contrast, or maybe it's something a little more in the middle. I would say this is pretty in the middle as far as contrast goes, right? This orange isn't super dark, but the pink is fairly light, so it's sort of a medium to light range rather than a dark to light range in terms of the contrast. So with color work, you really want to think about what relationship you want those two colors to have to one another. Now, it is worth noting that especially if you're doing stranded color work, like bulky stripes, you don't need as much contrast to be able to see. With stranded color work, the more contrast you have, the more it's going to really show off that color work. The lower your contrast, the more you risk that it's going to get sort of lost and that whatever pattern you're creating isn't going to be really possible to make out from a distance. But I do think that there is a range that is still in the realm where you can make it out, but that is still far from high contrast, that can be really beautiful and can produce some really sort of unexpected results. So value, remember our light to dark, is kind of always what's going to affect contrast the most, but you can also get contrast through other means, right? Through saturation and through hue. Value just tends to be the most dramatic one. That's where most of your contrast is going to come from. And I always recommend with color work, if you have any uncertainty about the two colors you're pairing together, try taking a picture of them side by side and converting that picture to black and white. And that's going to show you the contrast in value. And so if those colors, when converted to black and white, look the same, that is bad news for you on the contrast front. That is a good indication that if you knit those up in stranded color work and then look at it from across the room, you will not be able to make out what it looks like. Whereas if you find a version of one of those colors that is darker or lighter than the original, if you look at that picture in black and white and you see more of a difference between those two colors, you're good to go. It's gonna pop, it's gonna show up. And again, in thinking about combining colors, don't forget about these three separate axes, right? Like two super saturated colors are gonna look very different paired together than one super saturated color and one more dull color. So let's sort of design like a fictional stripy sweater just to use as an example to show how we can tweak on these three different levers to get different results. So if we start with our main color and for our contrast, we only adjust one element, say we did same hue, same saturation, but different value, that could look something like this. Or if we did same hue, same value, different saturation, that could look like this. Or same saturation, same value, different hue could look like this, right? And that's only adjusting one of those levers. If we start changing two things at the same time, we might have the same hue, but different saturation and different value. We might have same saturation, different value, different hue, or we might have same value, different saturation, different hue. Okay, there are infinite possibilities, especially when you think about the fact that you could be changing all three of these levers. You could be adjusting all of these things at the same time. So there are infinite possible color combinations. And these are all just the different ways that if something isn't quite working, it might be because you just need to tweak one of them a little more in one direction. But if you're trying to pair colors and you don't want to do a neutral and you don't want to do a neutral color, if you're trying to pair two colors, this is where it can really help to look at the color wheel when you're trying to pick your hues. So this is where, again, we're going to get into a little bit of like classroom color theory here. I apologize, but if we're trying to come up with color palettes, there are a few kind of main classic color palettes that are go-tos that are good to know. So first up, we have complementary colors. These are the ones that sit opposite of each other on the color wheel. So whatever color you're starting with, look across the color wheel from that color and you will find its opposite or its complement. Now, complementary colors are extremely aggressive in their contrast from one another in terms of their hue contrast, okay? They are as different as they could possibly be, which means that if you put them together directly side by side at equal intensities, it's a lot. It tends to create kind of a visual, like vibrating effect. It's not comfortable on the eyes. It really pops, but in a way that to a lot of people is sort of too much and unsettling. And usually if you see two complementary colors used together, one or both have sort of been mediated a little bit in some way or another in order to reduce that direct conflict just a little bit. So this might be, for example, adjusting the value of one or both. Red and green as the colors of Christmas are very classic examples of this. If you've always felt like the colors of Christmas are a little bit ugly, this would be why. It's also why I think we tend to see a lot of more classy looking Christmas things really lean into a darker green because that makes it a little bit less of an aggressive match against the bright red. So choosing complementary colors is a strong way to create really aggressive contrast, but in order to make it usable, wearable, look-atable, we usually will have to do some amount of modifying to make them different on some axes other than hue in order for them to cooperate. I also tend to, because in my work as a designer, I often need to pick a color that's going to really contrast, right? Say I'm making a graphic that has a button on it. You always want a button to stand out. So I will often be thinking about the complementary color of whatever the background is, but I often like to soften that by, instead of doing the direct opposite, I will look at what's opposite and then I'll like scoot over in the color wheel just a little bit. So like maybe instead of using green as the contrast color on a red, I might go over a little bit into a turquoise. Another classic way to build a color palette is to look at analogous colors. So these are the ones that are just side by side on the color wheel. They're already hanging out together. They like to be together. They're very comfortable together. Analogous color palettes are much softer and easier on the eyes and just more integrated than a complementary color palette. So blues and purples are always going to go really nicely. Greens and blues are always going to go really nicely. Reds and yellows, right? Anything that is sitting close to one another on the color wheel, they're always going to look good together. It's kind of hard to go wrong there. You might find you get awkward combos if you start pushing those other levers of saturation and value in weird ways. So again, like maybe a super saturated red might look weird with a super desaturated orange. But in general, analogous colors just get along. But if you like a super cohesive color palette that's very integrated, you cannot get any more integrated than the monochromatic color palette, which is a color palette that uses only one hue and just using different values of that same hue. Now you can also get a very different effect if you're looking at, sort of depends. Some people would debate about whether this would be a monochromatic outfit or not, because we could have, say, a monochromatic outfit that is all different values of the same hue at the same saturation level. This would be a very classic monochromatic look. But you could also have a monochromatic look that uses the same hue, uses different values, but also uses different saturation levels, which does give us more contrast between the two pieces. It's not quite as unified a whole as the other version of the monochromatic. It's not as cohesive. There's more variety within it, but it is still all working within the same hue. So those are the three simplest ways to create a color palette. But if you're looking to work with 3 or more colors, there are a few more sort of classic color palette options to look at. Now, the simplest version of these is the triadic color palette. So this is any 3 colors that are equally spaced on the color wheel. So that would be, for example, the classic primary colors. Those are a triadic color palette. They are equally spaced, as are the secondary colors, right? As are this combination of the tertiary colors. And then very similarly, we have the square palette, which is the exact same premise, except that it's 4 equally spaced colors instead of 3. And this is where you'll see it starting to get into more sort of unexpected color combinations, things you might not see quite as often. And it kind of gets us into this range of sort of playfulness that is a little bit unusual, and I think this is a really fun realm to be in. As is my favorite version of like a color palette formula, which is the split complement. So this is building off of the idea of a complementary color. Returning again to the idea of red and green as a complementary color palette, it's so aggressive. I don't like it. I would not come up with this as a color palette for anything, even if it were not so strongly associated with Christmas and that being like an intrusive factor that I'm not generally looking for in my color palettes. But you can modify the complementary color palette of red and green if we convert it into a split complement, which means we leave one of our colors as is. So let's keep our red in place. But if instead of pairing it with its exact opposite green, we can pair it with a blue-green and a yellow-green, which just gives it a much softer effect. I like this so much more as a color combination. I based my like university dorm room around this color palette. I love this. I hate red green. I love this. So a split complement is a way that you can sort of take advantage of a lot of the fun pop and contrast that you get from a complementary color palette while softening it enough for it to be like palatable, you know? I like this a lot better. I find that this is a really fun way to work with color. Remember though, as I show you all of this on the color wheel, this color wheel is based off of the primary colors. So these are very pure saturated tones, but all of these ideas around the relationships between particular colors relative to their positions on the wheel, all of that applies in the exact same way if we were looking at a more earth tone version of the color wheel, if we're looking at a pastel version, if we're looking at a dark version, if we're looking at a super saturated neon version. all of the same ideas apply. It's still all just about where these things are relative to one another in this wheel. And the more that you play around with this, the more that you try to come up with color schemes, the more fun it will be and the more you can learn from it. And actually my favorite way of doing this, I think something that has really helped me to build this skill set, like I said, it's not something that I felt come super naturally to me. I really love playing around with the web tool Coolors. It's this like web-based site where it just starts with, I think it's 5 color swatches. And every time you hit the spacebar, it's gonna randomly generate a brand new palette for you. And when it generates a color that you really like, you can click a little lock icon, so that swatch will stay the same. While every time you press the spacebar, all the other colors will change around it. And so you start to see how this one color that you like interacts with the colors around it. How does it look different depending on what's around it? And you can slowly build a palette by going, oh, okay, I really like this new color that's popped up. Let me also save this one. Keep going, keep generating. Oh, I really like this one. That really, okay, I wouldn't have like thought to put that with those other 2 colors, but that, I really like how those look together. Let me save that one. And you can keep doing this. And it's really helped me over time to build an understanding of how colors that might not have occurred to me could really bring something that I really like into this palette. And I think that even if you're not necessarily building that skill set and really learning that for yourself over time, like if you want to know nothing about color theory, like I should have just told you this at the start of the video, just go to Coolors, just press spacebar until you find an option that you like because it really is a useful tool. If you were completely at sea, you could just start from scratch and hit that spacebar until you like something. Or if you have one color that you know you want to work with and you're just really stuck on what to combine with it, you can also enter in the code for your particular color and then just hit spacebar until you find something that combines with it that you like. I think you can also adjust it, like the number of swatches that are there. So say you're only trying to plan 2 colors for a 2-color color work, you can adjust it to 2 swatches, you can put in the color you already know you want, and you can just hit spacebar watching that one swatch change until you hit something that you're like, there it is, it's perfect, it's magic. So that's it for the sort of theory side. Congratulations, you survived. You learned color theory and you're still here, okay? And I thought that now that we know these basics, it might help to just sort of look at some case studies. So I thought let's just look at some of the knits that I've made and think about how these ideas of color theory apply in these particular cases. Let's go chronologically from my early projects, just looking at the ones that I think have anything sort of interesting to look at in terms of color. So one of my early ones was my quilted sweater coat. So this one is a combination of a neutral with some colors, right? And I think what's notable here is that the colors that are paired with this they're quite desaturated, right? Like that's a pretty dark rusty orange. It's a sort of dusty pink. It's a mustardy yellow. Like nothing here is bright, bright, bright. And I think that that sort of helps it to pair pretty naturally with this sort of earthy, warm gray-brown color. And then related, if we look at my Laura Delgard and Tarja sweater, this is using those same 3 colors. It just doesn't have a neutral in it. And I feel like these principles kind of illustrate both what I do and don't love about this sweater. So one of those being that the value of the orange, it's just a darker value than the pink and the yellow are. And recognizing that at the time, I did make a decision that I think was smart and made sense, which was that on the front, one side of the squiggle, like there's more of one color than the other. And so I decided to make the side that is smaller be the one in the orange because I knew that that darker value would give it more sort of visual weight. And that if that much visual weight were on the side that was bigger, that would make it feel more lopsided, whereas having it on the smaller side would help that smaller side to kind of counterbalance the larger side. However, I do find myself wishing when I look at this sweater that the pink and the yellow had a little bit more value contrast between the 2 of them, just because when you're looking at the contrast between those 2 directly compared to the contrast between them and the orange is just so much more significantly different that I feel like you sort of lose some of the graphic impact of the squiggle where the pink and the yellow meet. And if I were to do this design again, I don't even think that I needed to replace the yellow with something that would contrast the pink more, that would compete more effectively with the orange. I think I would probably actually go the other way and just soften the orange to something a little bit lighter. And the whole thing could be lower contrast, but it would be more sort of in proportion to all of the other colors with an equal amount of contrast. And then if we look at my squiggle sweater, this one is super like graphic, bold, high impact, which is because these colors are different in every conceivable way. We have a relatively low saturation blue that is very dark compared to a red that is quite mid-tone and very saturated. And in fact, I had an early sort of false start on this one because I had ordered yarn that I thought I was going to use for the blue. It was called a navy. Online it looked like a classic navy, but when it showed up, it was super saturated. It was like a quite dark royal blue. And I really hated how that super saturated blue looked against the super saturated red. It felt clownish to me, like it felt like literally part of a clown costume. And the way that I resolved that was by going, okay, I'm going to use that yarn for something else. And I'm going to get a less saturated blue that's going to help ground this super vibrant red. I wanted something that would make the whole garment feel a little more sophisticated on the whole, while incorporating the super saturated red, and that meant getting a less saturated color to ground it. And then if we look at my Sailor Swift, this one is very different. This is neutral on neutral, but it's very high contrast in terms of value, right? We have a very like light beigey color and a very dark browny color. Hue is basically the same, right? They're both basically brown, just different light and dark versions of that brown. The saturation is pretty much the same. Brown is basically a desaturated orange. So it really is just the value here that's different, but that value is really dramatically different, which is where you get the high contrast striping from. And then my Lyon sweater that I'm currently wearing. So this is a color on color combo, so complete opposite of the Sailor Swift. And like I said, I think this one is more sort of medium contrast overall. And this one is a pretty low contrast in terms of hue because it's orange and pink, which is a lighter shade of red. So orange and red very close together on the color wheel, right? That's analogous. And they're also both pretty similar in terms of saturation. Both are like reasonably bright, but not like super in your face. And that is again, actually another case of I first ordered a yarn for this project and went, no, that's actually not the right color combo, because the pink that I got initially was a bit of a dustier pink. And when it arrived, I was like, oh, that is too desaturated next to this orange. I really didn't like how they combined together, and I decided that I needed to return that yarn and go for something that was more saturated instead, which is where I landed on this pink that gives it a much more sort of fun and playful color combo look rather than the like earthier vibe that I was getting when I was using a dustier pink. So that means that basically all the contrast that we're getting here is just from the difference in value, right? The orange is significantly darker than the pink, and that's what's giving us our contrast. Then if we look at my Tucker fade, so this one I have 3 different yarns fading into each other. So here our fade is transitioning in a couple of different ways. So we can see it's transitioning in terms of value, right? It's lighter at the top and darker at the bottom. And it's also fading in terms of hues from sort of yellows and pinks into blues and purples and teal at the bottom. The one thing that stays mostly the same is the saturation. These are all pretty equally vibrant but sort of soft versions of these colors. And then my Serendipity, like I mentioned before, this one is a neutral color combo. And so we have a lot of contrast here between the main color, the dark brown, the almost white at the neck, and the color in the middle. So we have this sort of super dark, super light, and something in the middle. So our tonal range is pretty big here. And I think what's important to note about using the color changing yarn and color work like this is there is a bit of shifting in value between those colors. Like the blue is darker than the like yellowy greeny color that is in there, but not super dramatically, so we can still make out the color work motif that it's a part of. If you are trying to use a color changing yarn in stranded color work, I think this is super important to pay attention to. If there is a huge tonal range in that yarn, it is not going to work well for stranded color work in terms of your motif coming through. If you're using a yarn that's going from basically white to basically black and you're contrasting it against basically any color, it's going to get lost because that tonal range is competing with the value of the thing that you're trying to contrast it against. You cannot contrast things that have the same value. It just doesn't work. So if you're looking to use a color changing yarn in color work, which I think is a super fun way to use color changing yarn, especially if like me, you just don't tend to love how it looks to knit like an all over piece in a color changing yarn, I think this is a great way to do it. But you want to look for color changing yarn that has a relatively even value all throughout. It isn't doing a lot of changing from light to dark to show off your color work that you put into it. to its best effect. And then if we look at my Ardent top, this is an interesting case to me because this is a difference almost entirely of saturation. There's a slight value difference here. The yellow is a little bit darker if you convert this into black and white, but they're very similar, and also in terms of hue, because this beige is basically just a super desaturated yellow, and this yellow is just a super saturated, like highlighter mode yellow. So they're extreme opposites in that respect, but the value is very similar. The hue is basically the same. You can do a lot with just saturation, and this is where the idea of neons and neutrals as a pairing is really fun to me. And then kind of the opposite of that is my kilometer scarf, where really the only difference here between the colors is the values. The saturation and the hue are pretty consistent because the base yarns that I was using, most of them came from a set that were all designed to work together in that way. And then to help blend in the scrap yarn that I was trying to integrate into this project, I also held double throughout the whole project a really substantial fluff yarn that gave it this consistent overlay of this like bright corally hue that is really saturated. And so it's really just the changes in lights and darks that you see throughout, contrasting these different sections. So I think that basically concludes my lecture. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk about color theory. I hope that this has given you some ways to think about the colors and the palettes that you might encounter in the knitting world, given you some options if you see something that you almost like and you're trying to figure out why it's just not quite perfect and what you could adjust to make it more you. Or if you're starting with a pattern that you like the cut of the pattern, but you find all of these colors that you're seeing it in really boring, but you're having a hard time coming up with a totally different combination, some ways that you might think about that, some starting points for you. And ultimately it's about empowering yourself to be able to pick colors that you are going to enjoy working with and actually enjoy wearing at the end of the day. So let me know, was this helpful, or do you have any more questions that I can help answer? Let me know what has been your sort of relationship to picking colors for your knits up to this point. Do you find it easy? Do you struggle with it? What have you learned along the way? I would love to know. And just a reminder that I do have a Patreon. If you want to support the channel, absolutely zero pressure. But if you want to come hang out, you get early access to videos. We have a monthly book club. I send you a postcard in the mail. It's all very cute. But thank you so much for coming to knit with me. If you'd like to be here next time, I hope you'll consider subscribing if you haven't already. If you already have, you're my favorite, and I'll see you next time. Bye.